Cyprus. Owing to its strategic location in the eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus has over the centuries seen its fair share of war and upheaval. Only 4 years after gaining its independence from Britain in 1960, the UN Security Council established a peacekeeping force in Cyprus known as UNFICYP. The mission was set up to quell the fighting that had broken out between the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots over disagreements on how to share power in their newly formed republic. Nicosia Airport. The arrival of the United Nations, comprising of Sweden and Finland. They were welcomed by the officials of the Cyprus government. Then came the Irish. The government of Ireland had previously sent troops to restore peace in the Congo, once again responding to the United Nations appeal. The United Nations set up observation posts and patrolled the island, establishing relative peace on the island. The Irish troops served in Xerox, Famagusta, Larnaca, under the canvas tents, while the other troops had the luxury of prefab buildings for their accommodation. When confrontations took place between the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot forces, the Irish were always on hand to negotiate and quell any potential conflict between the sides with great success. In addition to carrying out their duties, they availed of recreational activities by visiting the beach, playing sports, shooting competitions against other nations serving Cyprus. Not only did the presence of the United Nations in Cyprus quell potential conflict, it established Cyprus as a holiday country for visitors from overseas, which was a great boost for the financial benefits of the people of Cyprus. As a result of the Troubles in 1969, our troops were withdrawn from Cyprus, leaving a staff of 3 serving in headquarters, rotating up to 1985. This is an example of the tourist attractions and beaches now enjoyed by visitors. This ended abruptly on the 20th of July 1974, when the Turkish army invaded Cyprus with battleships north of Kyrenia. Air attacks, troop landings by the sea, and paratroopers dropped north of Nicosia and the airport area. The jets attacked the headquarters of the Greek Cypriot troops and Nicosia International Airport. Fierce fighting took place between the opposing forces, with the Turkish army advancing towards Nicosia, east towards Famagusta and west to Morphu. This resulted in the Greeks retreating to the vicinity of the UN camps and digging in on the perimeter. This put United Nations troops in a very dangerous situation by direct mortar and gunfire from the advancing Turks. United Nations troops were deployed to Nicosia International Airport as the Greeks withdrew on advice of the United Nations. They had instructions to defend the airport at all costs, even by force, from the Turks, which seemed to be their main objective. For 3 days the airport was under constant attack by the Turkish forces and jets. Fire was returned by United Nations. Eventually the Turks accepted it was the United Nations troops in the airport and not Greek troops. Then they agreed to move outside the north perimeter of the airport. After strenuous negotiations between opposing forces and United Nations, a ceasefire was arranged. At this stage, the Turkish forces had taken almost 40% of the island to the north and divided the island in 2, at which it remains to this day. A huge loss of life and missing persons resulted in the fighting. Nicosia Airport is now a place where time stood still since 1974. This was once the main airport in Cyprus. Trapped in the buffer zone, it is now a rotten and forlorn. This is the buffer zone in Nicosia, where few people will ever get to see or visit. It is in the heart of Nicosia centre, where time stands still. The streets have been deserted since the ceasefire in 1974. When fighting broke out in 1974, the people who lived fled and left everything behind. The area was ransacked during the fighting. Now the buildings stand crumbling, entwined by barbed wire, scarred by the violence. After all the destruction, there are still items that survive to this day and still on display in shops. This is the ghost city of Famagusta, once a main tourist area of Cyprus, with superb restaurants, hotels and bars, skyscraper buildings and beautiful golden beaches, which were thronged by tourists all year. The city was deserted during the fighting. It was sealed off by land and sea by the Turkish forces. The city still stands as it did in 1974 today, with goods rotten in shops, cars in garages and all the buildings deserted. It has started to crumble and deteriorate, with trees and weeds growing up through buildings and streets. Only United Nations may enter the city to patrol, but cannot stop or dismount their vehicles. The areas are constantly patrolled by United Nations to ensure no one intentionally or accidentally enters the buffer zone. It would be madness to do so. Despite the setbacks, the United Nations have never stopped trying to arrange talks between both sides. Thus, the leaders from both sides meet to negotiate. Many hope for reconciliation, but others find the past too painful. The future for the island is uncertain, but the United Nations endeavour to keep talks ongoing.